Imagine having everything. Billions in your bank account, a tech empire at your fingertips, your name in every major publication, only to discover that your greatest legacy would come not from your own genius, but from a teenage girl you never meant to meet, a girl who was solving problems you'd never even considered, at 2 a.m. in her father's basement. This isn't fiction. This is the story of Thomas Reid and Sophia Alvarez, and how one chance encounter changed the face of medicine forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Reid's reflection stared back at him from the obsidian glass wall of his penthouse office, 52 floors above Seattle's rain-slicked streets. At 43, he had the trim physique of someone who paid other people to keep him healthy, and the carefully tailored appearance of a man who hadn't chosen his own clothes in a decade. His company, Horizon Medical Systems, had revolutionized hospital management software, making him the 8th wealthiest person in America, a fact that had long ceased to bring him any satisfaction. Outside, the city lights blurred in the persistent drizzle, mirroring the headache that had been his constant companion for weeks now. 3 empty coffee cups littered his desk, beside stacks of reports, showing exactly what he already knew. Innovation at Horizon had flatlined. Their stock was beginning to stagnate. The board was growing restless. "Mr. Reid," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board is assembled for the emergency meeting." Thomas didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the framed magazine covers on his wall, Forbes, Fortune, Time, all proclaiming him a visionary, a disruptor, the future of healthcare technology. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had built an empire by predicting the future couldn't see his own. "Mr. Reid," the voice came again, more insistent this time. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," Thomas finally replied, straightening his tie and reaching for the bottle of premium painkillers he kept in his desk drawer. The headaches had begun 6 months ago, around the same time the innovation reports started showing troubling patterns. The boardroom fell silent as Thomas entered. 12 faces turned toward him, expressions ranging from concern to poorly concealed hostility. At the far end sat Elaine Winters, his CFO and oldest friend, though friend had become a nebulous concept in Thomas's world. No one befriended a billionaire. They befriended what a billionaire could do for them. "Let's not waste time," Thomas said, remaining standing. "Our Q3 numbers are concerning. Our flagship product hasn't seen meaningful innovation in 18 months. Our competitors are gaining ground." Marcus Chen, head of R&D, cleared his throat. "Thomas, we've been over this. We've increased our research budget by 40% this year alone. Sometimes innovation can't be forced." "Can't be forced?" Thomas's voice remained quiet, which everyone in the room knew was more dangerous than if he'd shouted. "We have 5,000 of the brightest minds in medical technology on our payroll. We've poached talent from every major competitor. We've acquired 7 startups this year, and you're telling me innovation can't be forced?" "What Marcus means," Elaine interjected, "is that we might need to reconsider our approach. Perhaps our focus has become too narrow." Thomas loosened his tie slightly. The headache was intensifying, a persistent throb behind his left eye. "Our focus is exactly what made this company successful. We solve real problems in healthcare administration. We make hospitals run more efficiently. And we've dominated that market," said James Robertson, a board member who had never particularly hidden his ambition to see Thomas step down. "But healthcare is evolving beyond administration. The real innovations are happening in patient care, in treatment, in personalized medicine, areas we've strategically avoided." Thomas felt a flicker of the old rage, the same fire that had propelled him from a scholarship student with nothing to his name to the boardrooms of power. We avoided those areas because they're speculative, because they don't scale reliably, because you don't understand them," James interrupted. The room fell deadly silent. No one interrupted Thomas Reid. "You understand systems, Thomas. You understand efficiency and optimization, but you've never understood the human element of healthcare, and that's where the future is heading." Thomas stood perfectly still, aware that every eye was on him, measuring his reaction. The pain behind his eye had become almost unbearable. "Is that the board's consensus view?" Elaine spoke carefully. "The board believes we need to expand our vision. We've commissioned a report on potential acquisitions in patient-centered healthcare technology. We'd like you to review it." "I see." Thomas's voice was colorless. "And if I disagree with this new direction?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Later that night, Thomas stood on his penthouse balcony, rain soaking through his expensive shirt. The headache had evolved into something worse, a pressure that made the edges of his vision blur. The board's implicit threat hung in the air like the city's perpetual mist: expand or be replaced, evolve or become obsolete. He reached for his phone to call Elaine, to argue his case again, but stopped. What was the point? The truth was, they were right. Horizon had plateaued under his leadership. The brilliance that had built a tech empire had calcified into stubbornness. The man who had once seen opportunities where others saw only obstacles now clung to outdated visions. Thomas Reid was becoming obsolete in his own company. The pain spiked suddenly, driving him to his knees. The phone clattered to the wet balcony floor as he pressed his palms against his temples. This was no ordinary headache. Through the haze of pain, one clear thought emerged. Something was very wrong. The next thing Thomas remembered was the ceiling of an ambulance, the wail of sirens, a paramedic leaning over him asking questions he couldn't process. Then darkness again, consuming and complete. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He awoke to the steady beep of hospital monitors and the antiseptic smell that no amount of luxury hospital suites could disguise. His mouth was desert dry, his thoughts foggy. A doctor stood at the foot of his bed, reviewing a tablet with a frown that immediately sent ice through Thomas's veins. "Mr. Reid," the doctor said, noticing he was awake. "I'm Dr. Patel. You're at Seattle Memorial." "What happened?" Thomas's voice was a rasp. "You experienced a severe cerebral hemorrhage, bleeding in your brain. Your security team found you unconscious on your balcony and called 911. We performed emergency surgery to relieve the pressure." Thomas tried to process this information through the fog of medication. "But I'm fine now." Dr. Patel set down the tablet and moved closer. His expression was grave but compassionate. "The hemorrhage occurred in a delicate area of your brain. While we were able to stop the bleeding and relieve the pressure, there was some damage to neural tissue." "Damage," Thomas repeated. The word hung in the air, clinical and devastating. "What kind of damage?" "The affected area controls certain cognitive functions, specifically those related to pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and some aspects of critical thinking. These are areas crucial to the kind of work you do." Thomas stared at the doctor, waiting for the punchline, for the solution, for the workaround. There was always a solution, always a way to optimize around problems. "So, what's the treatment plan? How do we fix this?" Dr. Patel's silence was answer enough, but he continued. "The brain has remarkable plasticity. With intensive rehabilitation, you may recover some function. But I need to be honest with you. You're unlikely to regain your previous cognitive capabilities in these specific areas. This will affect your ability to process complex data, to see connections between disparate systems. "You're telling me I can't think the way I used to?" Thomas interrupted, his voice flat. "You're telling me I've lost the one thing that made me who I am?" "No," Dr. Patel said firmly. "I'm telling you that one aspect of your cognitive function has been altered. Who you are encompasses far more than your analytical abilities." But Thomas had stopped listening. The empire he had built, the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him, was founded on his unique ability to see patterns others missed, to construct elegant solutions to complex problems. Without that, who was he? What value did he have? The news broke the next morning. Tech billionaire Thomas Reid suffers brain hemorrhage. Horizon Medical Systems stock plummets. By afternoon, Reid down was trending. By evening, the board had appointed Elaine as interim CEO during Thomas's recovery period. A polite fiction they both knew masked a permanent transition. 3 weeks later, Thomas Reid, once the darling of tech media and the ruthless visionary behind America's leading medical systems company, was released from the hospital. He refused the wheelchair, insisted on walking out on his own power, and ignored the reporters camped outside. His driver waited with the car door open. Thomas paused before entering, looking back at the hospital building, a facility that ran on his software, that functioned efficiently because of his vision, that would continue to operate perfectly well without him. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. Thomas had no answer. His penthouse felt like a museum to a life that no longer existed. His office belonged to someone else now. He had no family, having sacrificed any chance at personal relationships on the altar of his ambition. He had colleagues but no friends, admirers but no confidants. "Sir?" the driver prompted again. "The lake house," Thomas said finally, naming the property he had purchased 5 years ago and visited exactly twice. It was remote, isolated, and, most importantly, far from the pitying eyes of Seattle's tech community. The Lake Washington property sat nestled among towering pines, its modernist glass and cedar architecture jutting over the water. It had been designed by a famous architect, featured in architectural magazines, and then promptly forgotten by its owner. Thomas had bought it as an investment, not a home. Now, as the car pulled up the long, winding driveway, he wondered if it would become his mausoleum. The house was cold, dust covers still draped over furniture. Thomas dismissed the driver, ignored the boxes of his personal effects from the office that had been delivered ahead of him, and walked directly to the wall of windows overlooking the lake. Rain pattered against the glass, creating rivulets that distorted the view of dark water beyond. Appropriate, he thought. Everything in his world had become distorted. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and closed his eyes. The doctors had explained that while the hemorrhage had affected specific cognitive functions, his intelligence remained largely intact. He could still read, write, speak articulately, manage his daily affairs. What he had lost was far more subtle. The ability to rapidly process complex patterns, to intuitively grasp the interrelationships between systems, to envision elegant solutions to multifaceted problems. The very skills that had made him a tech visionary. In their place was a persistent mental fog, moments of confusion, and a maddening inability to hold complex concepts in his mind long enough to work with them. He could still recognize brilliant ideas. He just couldn't generate them anymore. The first month at the lake house passed in a blur of rain, painkillers, and silent rage. Thomas rejected calls from Elaine, from the few business associates who still reached out, from the rehabilitation specialists the hospital had recommended. He fired the personal assistant who tried to establish a recovery routine. He dismissed the private chef who attempted to prepare nutritious meals. He wanted nothing, no one. His days developed a grim pattern. Wake at noon, attempt to read industry. News until the words swam before his eyes. abandon the effort, drink expensive scotch, and stare at the lake until sleep claimed him. Occasionally, he would try to work through simple business problems, the kind he would have solved in seconds before, only to find himself frustrated to the point of throwing things against the wall. The second month, the calls dwindled. The tech world moved on. Horizon announced a major acquisition in patient-centered healthcare technology, exactly the direction the board had pushed for before his collapse. The stock rose. The market applauded. Thomas became a cautionary tale, a case study in founder obsolescence. It was during this period that the plumbing in the lake house, neglected for months, finally rebelled. Thomas awoke one morning to find water seeping under the bathroom door, the sound of a steady drip echoing through the house. He stared at it for several minutes, his mind struggling to process the problem and its solution with the foggy indifference that had become his new normal. Eventually, the practical part of his brain, the part that still functioned, took over. He found the number for a local plumber in the house manual and made the call. "Alvarez Plumbing," a cheerful voice answered. "I need someone to fix a leak," Thomas said, his voice rough from disuse. "Today. We're pretty booked up, but I'll pay triple your normal rate," Thomas interrupted. Money was the one tool he still knew how to wield effectively. There was a pause. "Address?" 4 hours. Later, a battered blue truck with Alvarez Plumbing, hand-painted on the side, pulled up to the house. Thomas watched from the window as a stocky man in his 40s climbed out, tool belt already secured around his waist. He had the weathered look of someone who worked with his hands, dark hair threaded with grey, and a face that seemed designed, if a smiling, though at the moment he was regarding the massive modernist house with an expression of wary appreciation. Thomas opened the door before the man could knock. "Mr. Reid?" the plumber asked, extending a hand. "Miguel Alvarez, you've got a leak?" Thomas ignored the outstretched hand. "Bathroom? This way." He turned and walked without checking if the man followed. The bathroom was now thoroughly flooded, water seeping into the expensive hardwood of the hallway. Miguel surveyed the damage without comment, then knelt and opened his toolbox. "Any idea what caused it?" he asked, examining the pipes under the sink. "If I knew that, I wouldn't have called you," Thomas replied, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. Miguel glanced up, his expression neutral. "Fair enough." He returned to his work, the silence broken only by the occasional clink of tools and splash of water. Thomas stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure of the protocol. Before, he would have returned to his work, left the details to an assistant. Now, he had nowhere to go, nothing demanding his attention. He found himself watching Miguel's methodical movements, the sure confidence of someone who thoroughly understood their domain. Here's your problem," Miguel said after several minutes. "The previous owner did some non-standard modifications to the plumbing. Looks fancy, but it's put unusual stress on these joints. Plus, the house has been sitting empty, right? That can cause seals to dry out." Thomas was surprised by the clear explanation. Yes, it was, unoccupied for some time. Miguel nodded, already reaching for a replacement part. "Vacation home." Something like that. The plumber worked in silence for a few more minutes, then asked, "You're the tech guy, right? The one who made the hospital software?" Thomas stiffened. "I was. My wife's a nurse at Evergreen Medical. Says your system saves her an hour of paperwork every shift." Miguel smiled briefly. "She used to come home with her hand cramped from all the forms, so thanks for that." The simple gratitude caught Thomas off guard. In his previous life, success had been measured in market share and stock prices, not in hours saved for individual nurses. He didn't know how to respond, so he said nothing. Miguel seemed unfazed by the silence. He continued working, occasionally explaining what he was doing in clear, straightforward terms. Thomas found himself oddly soothed by the man's calm competence, by the simple logic of plumbing. Water flowed one way, pressure built up, joints failed, repairs were made. Cause and effect, problem and solution. No ambiguity, no shareholders, no obsolescence. That should do it, Miguel said finally, tightening the last connection. I've fixed the immediate problem, but honestly, whoever installed this system did you no favors. If you're planning to stay here long term, you might want to consider having me come back and redo some of these connections properly. Thomas looked at the now dry floor, the neatly organized tools, the simple efficiency of the repair. How much do I owe you? Miguel named a figure that, even tripled as promised, seemed absurdly small to Thomas. He went to his office, returned with cash, and handed it over without counting. This is too much, Miguel said, looking at the stack of bills. You fixed the problem efficiently. In Thomas's world, efficiency had always commanded a premium. Miguel hesitated, then tucked the money into his pocket. Well, thank you. And the offer stands. If you want me to come back and do a proper job on the rest of the plumbing, just call. Might save you some headaches down the road. Headaches. Thomas almost laughed at the irony. I'll consider it. After Miguel left, the house felt emptier somehow. Thomas wandered from room to room, suddenly aware of the dust, the covered furniture, the general air of abandonment. On impulse, he pulled the covers off a couch, sat down, and opened his laptop, something he had been avoiding for days. He navigated to the Horizon Medical Systems website. The homepage had been redesigned, his image removed from the leadership section. Elaine's face now smiled from the CEO position. There was a splash announcement about their new acquisition, a company developing AI-driven diagnostic tools. Exactly the kind of patient-centered technology the board had pushed for. Thomas stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar surge of anger, of betrayal. Instead, he felt something unexpected, a flicker of curiosity. What if they were right? What if he had become so fixated on systems and efficiency that he'd missed the human element of healthcare? What if his greatest innovation lay not behind him, but in an area he had never explored? The thought dissipated almost as quickly as it had formed, scattered by the cognitive fog that was his constant companion now. He closed the laptop and returned to staring out at the lake, but something had shifted. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of his isolation. 2 days later, he called Alvarez Plumbing again. The kitchen sink this time, he told Miguel when he answered. There was no leak, no emergency, just an undefined need to have another human being in the empty house. Someone who didn't know him as the brilliant mind he'd once been, who had no expectations beyond fixing pipes. Miguel arrived that afternoon, looking slightly confused when Thomas showed him to a perfectly functioning kitchen sink. I'm not seeing the problem, Mr. Reid, he said, running the water. Thomas hadn't thought this far ahead. It's, intermittent. Sometimes it stops draining properly. Miguel raised an eyebrow but knelt to examine the pipes anyway. Well, while I'm here, I might as well check the whole system. Some of these older lake houses can have quirky plumbing. For the next hour, Miguel methodically inspected every pipe, joint, and connection in the kitchen, occasionally asking Thomas to hand him a tool or hold a flashlight. Thomas found himself oddly engaged in the process, watching the logical progression of the diagnosis, the elimination of possibilities, the narrowing focus on potential issues. Everything looks fine to me, Miguel concluded, wiping his hands on a rag. But if you notice any actual problems, give me a call. Thomas nodded, feeling foolish. What do I owe you? For what? I didn't fix anything. Miguel shrugged. No, charge. But you spent an hour. Tell you what. Miguel interrupted with a smile. If it starts acting up for real, call me back. Otherwise, we're square." As Miguel packed up his tools, Thomas felt a strange reluctance to see him go. The house would be empty again, silent except for his own thoughts, which weren't the reliable companions they once had been. "Would you?" Thomas began, then stopped, unfamiliar with the vulnerability in his own voice. "Would you like a cup of coffee before you go?" Miguel looked surprised, then checked his watch. "Actually, I've got one more job scheduled, but thanks." He hoisted his toolbox, then hesitated. "You know, we're having a barbecue this Sunday. Nothing fancy, just some neighbors and friends. If you wanted to get out of the house, you'd be welcome to stop by." The invitation was so unexpected that Thomas didn't immediately know how to respond. Before his collapse, social events had been strategic opportunities. Networking, relationship cultivation, subtle negotiations. The concept of a casual barbecue with strangers was foreign territory. "I don't want to impose," he said finally. Miguel laughed. "It's not an imposition. It's a burger and a beer in a backyard. No big deal either way." He scribbled an address on the back of a business card and handed it to Thomas. "Starts around 2. Come if you feel like it." After Miguel left, Thomas stared at the card for a long time. His first instinct was to throw it away. What could he possibly have in common with a plumber and his friends? What would they talk about? How would he explain who he was, or rather, who he had been? But as the empty hours of the day stretched before him, as the silence of the house pressed in, Thomas found himself placing the card carefully on the kitchen counter instead of in the trash. Perhaps it was time to discover who Thomas Reid could be, now that he was no longer the genius who had built Horizon Medical Systems. Maybe it was time to start over. Sunday arrived gray and cool, typical northwestern spring weather. Thomas stood in front of his closet, staring at rows of custom suits, designer casual wear, and clothes that had never been worn outside of corporate retreats and industry conferences. Nothing seemed right for a backyard barbecue. He finally settled on the least ostentatious outfit he could assemble: dark jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and a light jacket. As he got into his car, the least flashy of the 3 vehicles in his garage, though still a luxury model, he caught himself wondering what had happened to the ruthlessly pragmatic businessman who had never cared what others thought of his wealth. The address Miguel had provided led to a modest neighborhood of well-maintained older homes. Thomas drove past the house twice before working up the courage to park. From the street, he could see people gathered in the backyard, maybe 15 or 20 adults, a handful of children running between them. Music played, not too loud. The smell of grilling meat wafted over the fence. Thomas sat in his car, hands tight on the steering wheel. What was he doing here? These weren't his people. This wasn't his world. He had spent a lifetime climbing away from exactly this kind of ordinary existence. But the alternative was returning to the empty lake house, to the silence, to the reminder of all he had lost. At least here, among strangers, he might be just another person for a few hours, not a fallen genius, not a cautionary tale, just a man at a barbecue. Before he could change his mind, Thomas got out of the car, walked to the gate, and entered the backyard. The Alvarez backyard was alive with conversation and laughter. String lights hung from the fence, casting a warm glow over picnic tables, covered in mismatched tablecloths. A man Thomas assumed was Miguel's brother tended a large grill, expertly flipping burgers while maintaining an animated conversation with the people around him. Children chased each other through the grass, their shrieking laughter punctuating the adult conversations. Thomas stood frozen just inside the gate, suddenly hyper-aware of how out of place he was. Before he could retreat, Miguel spotted him and waved, setting down his beer and making his way across the yard. "You made it," Miguel said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Thomas admitted. Miguel clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, I'm glad you did. Come on, let me introduce you to some people." Before Thomas could protest, Miguel was guiding him through the crowd. "Everyone, This is Thomas. He's new to the neighborhood." The introductions came quickly. Miguel's wife Elena, a nurse with intelligent eyes and an easy laugh, his brother Javier and sister-in-law Carmen, neighbors whose names blurred together, a co-worker from Miguel's plumbing business with his teenage sons. Everyone smiled, nodded, included him in the circle without questions or expectations. It was disorienting. In Thomas's previous life, every introduction was weighted with agenda, with knowledge of who he was and what he represented. Here, he was just a neighbor, a man at a barbecue, someone who might become a friend. "Beer," Miguel offered, handing him a bottle from a cooler before Thomas could respond. "Food's almost ready. Elena made her famous potato salad. You've got to try it." Thomas took the beer, oddly touched by the simple hospitality. "Thank you for inviting me." "Like I said, no big deal," Miguel replied with a shrug, but his smile was kind. "Sometimes people need to be around other people, you know." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion rose from the side gate. A teenage girl rushed in, breathless and excited, a laptop clutched to her chest. She was striking, tall and slender, with her father's warm eyes and an intensity that seemed to radiate from her. She wore jeans with artistic tears at the knees, a faded NASA t-shirt, and a look of barely contained excitement. "Dad," she called, scanning the yard until she spotted Miguel. "Dad, it worked. The algorithm worked." She rushed toward them, nearly colliding with Thomas in her enthusiasm. "Whoa, Sophia!" Miguel laughed, steadying his daughter. "Take a breath. Thomas, this is my daughter, Sophia. Sophia, this is Mr. Reid, a new client and neighbor." Sophia barely glanced at Thomas, her attention fixed on her father. "The patient matching algorithm. It worked on the test data set. 93% accuracy, Dad. 93%. Miguel looked both proud and slightly lost. "That's good, I think." He glanced at Thomas apologetically. "My daughter spends more time with computers than people. Apparently, it's genetic. Her grandfather was the same way." "It's not just good, it's incredible," Sophia insisted. She finally seemed to register Thomas's presence and turned to him with the direct gaze of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. "Do you know anything about algorithmic matching in healthcare data?" Before his injury, Thomas would have had a detailed, insightful answer. Now he felt the familiar fog descend, the struggle to grasp complex concepts. "I used to," he said carefully. "I worked in healthcare technology." Sophia's eyes widened with interest. "Really? What company?" "Horizon Medical Systems." The transformation in Sophia's expression was immediate and dramatic. Her casual interest morphed into intense focus. "Wait, Thomas Reid. You're that Thomas Reid." Thomas braced himself for the usual reaction, the awkward recognition, the careful avoidance of his downfall, the poorly disguised pity, but Sophia's reaction was entirely different. "Your work on medical systems interoperability is brilliant," she said, her words coming fast. "The way you solved the cross-platform data exchange problem with that distributed verification model was so elegant. I studied your API documentation when I was designing my prototype. It's..." She stopped abruptly, seemingly aware she was rambling. "Sorry, I'm a little obsessed with medical data systems." Thomas stared at her, feeling a strange mix of pride and loss. This brilliant young woman admired work he could no longer do, concepts he struggled to fully recall. "Thank you," he said simply. Miguel looked between them, clearly surprised. "Wait, you know each other's work?" "Dad," Sophia said with affectionate exasperation, "Thomas Reid is like the Steve Jobs of medical software. Horizon basically runs half the hospitals in the country." She turned back to Thomas, her enthusiasm undiminished. "I had no idea you lived around here. I thought you'd be in some glass tower in Seattle." "I needed a change," Thomas said carefully. Something in his tone must have registered with Sophia because her enthusiasm tempered slightly. Right. Of course. She glanced at her father, then back at Thomas. Well, it's really cool to meet you. An awkward silence threatened to descend, but was interrupted by Javier's announcement that the food was ready. The gathering shifted toward the tables laden with dishes. Miguel gave Thomas an apologetic smile. Sorry about that. Sophia gets a little intense about her projects. It's fine, Thomas assured him, surprised to find he meant it. Sophia's unguarded enthusiasm had been a refreshing change from the careful conversations he'd grown accustomed to. What is she working on, exactly? Miguel shrugged as he led Thomas toward the food. Something about matching patients to clinical trials. Elena, my wife, mentioned that a lot of patients miss out on experimental treatments because the matching process is too slow or inaccurate. Sophia took it as a personal challenge. She's been coding something in our basement for months now. In your basement? Thomas couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. A project like that would typically require significant resources, sophisticated equipment. She cobbled together some old computers, Miguel said with clear pride. Kids, resourceful, got a scholarship to the University of Washington for computer science, but she's taking a gap year to work on this project. Says she's close to a breakthrough. Before Thomas could respond, they reached the food tables and the conversation shifted. Throughout the meal, Thomas found himself seated with Eleanor and several other nurses who, upon learning of his background, eagerly shared stories of how technology had changed their work, for better and worse. He listened more than he spoke, finding an unexpected pleasure in hearing the frontline perspective on systems he had designed but never seen in action. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of Sophia, who had settled at a table with younger guests. Her laptop open, despite Elena's repeated reminders that this was a social event. There was something compelling about her focus, her obvious intelligence, her dismissal of social conventions in favor of her work. It reminded Thomas of himself at a younger age, before success had calcified into rigid thinking. As the evening progressed and the air cooled, people began to drift homeward. Thomas found himself lingering, reluctant to return to the emptiness of the lake house. He wandered toward the edge of the yard, where Sophia had set up with her computer, now alone. As her peers had moved on to a card game at another table. Mind if I join you? He asked, uncertain of his welcome. Sophia looked up, clearly surprised. Oh, sure, Mr. Reid. Thomas, please. He sat across from her, nodding toward her laptop. Your father mentioned you're working on a patient matching algorithm for clinical trials. Something cautious entered her expression. Yes, it's still early stages. I'm not going to steal your idea, Thomas said, recognizing her hesitation. Those days are behind me. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. It's not just matching patients to trials. That's been done before. Not very well, but it exists. I'm trying to create a predictive model that forecasts which patients are likely to respond positively to specific treatments based on complex biomarker patterns. Even with his cognitive limitations, Thomas recognized the ambition of her project. That's significant. The variables involved would be enormous. Exactly, Sophia said, warming to the subject. Most current systems use maybe 20 to 30 variables at most. I'm tracking over 400 biomarkers, plus environmental factors, medication interactions, genetic markers when available. She trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed. Sorry, people's eyes usually glaze over when I get into the details. My eyes might glaze over, Thomas admitted, but not from boredom. He hesitated, then added, I had a cerebral hemorrhage 7 months ago. It affected my ability to process complex patterns, the very thing you're describing. So, if I seem slow to grasp concepts that should be obvious, that's why. He hadn't intended to reveal this. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Sophia. Yet there was something liberating in stating his limitation plainly, without shame or defensiveness. Sophia's expression shifted, not to pity, but to thoughtful consideration. That must be incredibly frustrating for someone with your mind. It is, Thomas agreed, appreciating her directness. Like having a symphony in your head, but only being able to hum one note at a time. Sophia nodded slowly. I can't imagine, but the underlying knowledge is still there, right? Even if the processing is different. Thomas had never considered it this way. I suppose so. The doctors say the core intelligence is intact, just reconfigured. So, maybe you just need a different interface, Sophia said almost to herself. Then, more directly, would you be willing to look at my project sometime? Not right now, but maybe... I don't know. I could use someone with your experience to tell me if I'm on the right track. The request caught Thomas off guard. For months, he had been defined by what he could no longer do. No one had asked for his input, his expertise. They had written him off as damaged goods. I'm not sure how much help I'd be, he said honestly, but I'd be happy to try. Sophia smiled, the first genuine smile she'd directed at him. Great. I usually work nights. My brain seems to function better after dark. Weird, I know. Not weird at all, Thomas replied. I built the first version of Horizon's interoperability framework at 3 in the morning. They shared a moment of understanding, the peculiar fellowship of minds that came alive when the rest of the world slept. Then Elena called from across the yard that it was time to start packing up, and the moment passed. As Thomas said his goodbyes and drove back to the lake house, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a flicker of purpose. Not the driving ambition that had once defined him, but something gentler, a curiosity about Sophia's project, a desire to be useful in whatever capacity he still could be. For the first time since his collapse, Thomas Reid fell asleep without a drink, without rage, without the crushing weight of loss pressing down on him. Instead, his mind lingered on algorithms and biomarkers and the intensity in a young woman's eyes when she spoke of solving problems that mattered. 3 days passed before Thomas heard from Sophia. He'd begun to think the encounter had been a passing moment, quickly forgotten, when his phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Reid, Thomas, it's Sophia Alvarez. Dad gave me your number. Working on the predictive module tonight. If you're serious about taking a look, I'll be up late. Our address is 1824 Cedar Street. Thomas stared at the message, an unexpected nervousness rising. What if he couldn't understand her work? What if his limitations were humiliatingly obvious? What if he had nothing of value to offer? But the alternative, another night alone with the silence and the fog in his mind, was worse. He texted back, I'll be there around 9. The Alvarez home was a modest 2-story craftsman with a well-tended garden and warm light glowing from the windows. Thomas parked his car, conscious of how out of place it looked on the quiet residential street, and approached the front door with the strange feeling he was about to step into an entirely different world. Elena answered his knock, looking surprised but welcoming. Thomas! Sophia mentioned you might stop by. Come in. The house was exactly what Thomas would have expected. Comfortable, lived in, walls lined with family photos and children's artwork. The aroma of a recent meal lingered in the air. Miguel emerged from what appeared to be a home office, reading glasses perched on his nose. Thomas, good to see you. Sophia's in her natural habitat, the basement. He gestured toward a door, off the kitchen. Head on down. I'd offer to show you, but I've learned to stay out of her way when she's in the zone. Thomas descended the narrow stairs into what had clearly been transformed from an ordinary basement into a dedicated workspace. Computer equipment covered makeshift desks assembled from doors laid across sawhorses. Multiple monitors displayed scrolling data, complex diagrams, and lines of code. The walls were covered with printouts, sticky notes, and hand-drawn flowcharts connected by strings of different colors. In the center of this tech-filled chaos sat Sophia, headphones on, fingers flying across a keyboard. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice him until he was standing a few feet away. When she finally looked up, she nearly jumped out of her chair. "Whoa!" She yanked off her headphones. "Sorry, I didn't hear you come down." "I didn't mean to startle you," Thomas said, taking in the impressive setup. "Your father said I should just come down." "No, it's fine." She gestured to a chair beside her desk. "Thanks for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Thomas sat down, careful not to disturb the precarious stack of papers beside him. "This is quite an operation you've built here. It's primitive compared to what you had at Horizon, I'm sure," Sophia said with a self-deprecating shrug. "Maybe," Thomas admitted, "but some of the most innovative work happens in garages and basements, not corner offices." Sophia smiled at that. "That's what I keep telling my mom when she says this should be a proper guest room." She turned to her main screen. "So, I've been working on the core algorithm for patient treatment matching. The basic concept is to use machine learning to identify patterns in patient outcomes that humans might miss." Thomas nodded, focusing carefully on each word, determined not to let the fog take over. "Show me what you've got so far." For the next hour, Sophia guided him through her project, a sophisticated application that ingested vast amounts of clinical data, identified subtle patterns in treatment responses, and used those patterns to predict which patients would respond best to which treatments. The underlying algorithms were complex, but she explained each component with a clarity that helped Thomas follow, despite his limitations. "The real challenge," she said, pointing to a particularly dense section of code, "is dealing with incomplete data. Most patients don't have full biomarker profiles, genetic sequencing, or detailed environmental exposure histories. So the algorithm has to extrapolate from partial information." Thomas leaned closer to the screen, studying the approach she had taken. "You're using a Bayesian network for the missing data approximation." "Yes, but with a modified weighting system," Sophia explained. "Traditional Bayesian methods don't account well for the interdependence of certain biomarkers. I've developed a kind of adaptive weighting that adjusts based on which other markers are present or absent." As she continued explaining, Thomas found himself becoming increasingly engaged. The fog that had plagued his thinking seemed to thin slightly in the face of a concrete problem with defined parameters. He couldn't grasp all the complexities at once, as he once would have, but he could follow the thread of her logic, offer insights based on his years of experience. "The interface," he said, after she had walked him through the core functionality. "It's quite technical. Medical professionals are chronically short on time. They need results they can act on quickly." Sophia sighed. "I know. The UI is my weak point. I've been so focused on making the algorithm work that I haven't put much thought into how people will actually use it." "May I?" Thomas gestured to the keyboard. When she nodded, he opened a blank document and began sketching out a simpler interface design. His hands felt clumsy, his thoughts moving slower than they once had, but the basic principles of user-centered design were still accessible to him. "The key is to present complex data in a way that supports decision-making without overwhelming the user," he explained as he worked. "Color coding for treatment match probability, simplified visualization of key biomarkers, one-click access to the underlying data for those who want to dig deeper." Sophia watched intently. "That makes so much sense. I've been building this for other programmers, not for doctors and nurses. It's a common blind spot," Thomas said, remembering his own early failures at Horizon. We build tools that make sense to us, forgetting that the end users live in a different world. They continued working, Sophia implementing some of Thomas's interface suggestions while explaining more about her plans for expanding the system. As the night deepened, Thomas found himself more engaged, more present than he had been since before his collapse. He still struggled with the most complex concepts, still had moments where his mind seemed to hit a wall, but Sophia never made him feel less for it. She simply rephrased, slowed down, found another angle of approach. Around 2 a.m., Eleanor appeared at the bottom of the stairs, wrapped in a bathrobe. Sophia, it's a school night. She stopped when she saw Thomas. Oh, I thought you would have gone home hours ago. Thomas checked his watch, startled to find how much time had passed. I'm sorry, I didn't realize how late it had gotten. Mom, we're making real progress, Sophia said, failing to stifle a yawn that undermined her argument. Thomas helped me completely rethink the user interface, and he pointed out a flaw in my biomarker correlation matrix that would have taken me weeks to find on my own. Elena smiled, though there was concern in her eyes. That's wonderful, honey, but you both need rest. Thomas, would you like some coffee before you drive home? Thomas rose, suddenly aware of his stiff muscles and tired eyes. No, thank you. I should get going, but this was... He paused, searching for the right word. Illuminating. As he gathered his jacket, Sophia looked up from her computer. Would you be willing to come back? Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. There's so much more I want to show you, and your feedback is really helpful. Thomas hesitated only briefly. I'd like that. Driving home through the empty streets, Thomas realized something had shifted inside him. The fog was still there, the limitations real and frustrating, but for a few hours he had been useful again. He had contributed to something potentially important. He had been valued not for who he had been, but for who he was now. Back at the lake house, Thomas didn't immediately go to bed despite his fatigue. Instead, he went to his office and for the first time in months turned on his computer with purpose. He began researching the current state of clinical trial matching, the challenges in personalized medicine, the gaps in existing systems. His progress was slower than it would have been before. He had to take breaks when reading complex materials, had to make notes to compensate for his compromised working memory. But the work itself felt good, like stretching muscles that had been dormant too long. As dawn broke over the lake, Thomas finally went to bed. But before he slept, he set an alarm for the first time since leaving the hospital. He had things to do tomorrow. Over the next 3 weeks, a pattern emerged. 3 or 4 nights a week, Thomas would drive to the Alvarez home and descend into Sophia's basement workshop. Sometimes they would work for hours in near silence, each focused on their tasks, Sophia coding, Thomas researching or designing interface components. Other times, they would engage in spirited debates about approach and methodology, pushing each other's thinking in unexpected directions. Miguel and Elena had initially seemed bemused by Thomas's regular presence in their home at odd hours, but they quickly adapted. Elena would leave plates of food at the top of the stairs. Miguel would occasionally wander down with beers, ask a few questions about their progress, then retreat with a bemused shake of his head when the conversation turned technical. For Thomas, these nights became a lifeline, a connection to the intellectual engagement he had thought lost forever. He still struggled with the cognitive fog, still had moments of frustration when concepts that should have been simple eluded him. But Sophia never showed impatience, never made him feel less. Instead, she had an uncanny ability to break complex problems into smaller components he could grasp, to find alternative paths when direct routes were blocked. It's like having 2 different processors working on the same problem, she said one night, as they rebuilt a particularly troublesome section of the algorithm. You see things I miss because I'm too deep in the code. And you grasp mathematical. Relationships I can no longer hold in my head, Thomas added, without the bitterness that would have accompanied such an admission months earlier. We complement each other. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. That's what good teams do, right? Cover each other's blind spots. Teams. The word resonated with Thomas. He had led teams at Horizon, of course, managed hundreds of brilliant engineers and designers, but he had never truly been part of a team, never been in the trenches working side by side with equals. His position, his reputation, his ego had always created distance. Now in this basement, with this remarkable young woman, he was experiencing true collaboration for perhaps the first time, and despite all he had lost, it felt like a gift. One night, as they were testing a new version of the matching algorithm against a dataset Elena had provided from her hospital, Sophia's program returned results that made her gasp. "What is it?" Thomas asked, moving to look over her shoulder. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to a cluster of data points on the screen. The algorithm is showing a strong correlation between this specific combination of biomarkers and positive response to a treatment that doctors usually only try as a last resort. Thomas studied the data, focusing hard to see the pattern. Could be coincidental. How large is your sample? That's just it, Sophia said, excitement building in her voice. I've been running simulations with synthetic data to expand the sample size, and the correlation holds. If this is right, there's a whole subset of patients who could benefit from this treatment much earlier in their disease progression. They worked through the night, verifying the finding, testing it against additional data, refining the parameters. By morning, both were convinced. Sophia's algorithm had identified a previously unknown correlation that could significantly improve treatment outcomes for certain patients. We need to validate this with real-world testing, Thomas said, as they finally took a break, both exhausted but exhilarated. Which means we need access to larger datasets, clinical partnerships, regulatory approval for trials. Resources, Sophia said, leaning back in her chair. We need resources we don't have. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering options. In his previous life, he would have simply made a few calls, leveraged his position, opened doors with the weight of his name and wealth. Now, those paths were largely closed to him, but perhaps not entirely. I might know some people, he said. Carefully, former colleagues who owe me favors, investors who might be interested. Sophia looked at him, suddenly serious. Would they take us seriously? A college dropout working from her parents' basement and a... She stopped, clearly unsure how to describe Thomas's current status. A has-been with brain damage. Thomas supplied with a small smile. Maybe not, but they might take the idea seriously if we present it right. Sophia nodded slowly, then returned to her keyboard with renewed determination. Then let's make sure it's too good for them to ignore. As dawn turned the sky outside the small basement windows from black to grey, Thomas watched Sophia work, her focus absolute, her brilliance undeniable, her potential unlimited. He thought about the patterns her algorithm had discovered, patterns that human physicians had missed, patterns that could save lives. And for the first time since his collapse, Thomas Reid felt the stirring of something he had thought forever lost. Not just purpose, but vision. A glimpse of possibility beyond the limitations of his damaged mind, beyond the constraints of traditional thinking, beyond the boundaries that had defined his previous success. In this unlikely partnership, the fallen tech titan and the plumbers, a daughter, he sensed the beginnings of something more significant than anything he had built before. Not just a better algorithm or a more efficient system, but a fundamental reimagining of how technology could serve human health. As Sophia continued coding, oblivious to his thoughts, Thomas made a silent promise, not just to her, but to himself. Whatever resources he still had, whatever doors he could still open, whatever knowledge remained accessible to him, he would dedicate to bringing this vision to life. The path forward was uncertain, the challenges substantial. But for the first time in nearly a year, Thomas Reid looked to the future with something that felt remarkably like hope. Presenting Sophia's algorithm to potential investors proved more challenging than Thomas had anticipated. In the weeks that followed their breakthrough, he reached out to former colleagues and business contacts, only to be met with polite dismissals, or worse, pitying silence. His name no longer opened doors. Instead, it often closed them before conversations could even begin. "Another rejection," Thomas said, ending a video call in Sophia's basement workshop. "That's the 5th this week." Sophia barely looked up from her coding. "Their loss. We don't need them." Thomas admired her resilience but knew better. "Actually, we do. We need access to larger data sets for validation testing. We need regulatory experts to navigate FDA approval. We need clinical partnerships for trials. All of that requires resources." Sophia stopped typing and swiveled her chair to face him. Dark circles underlined her eyes after another all-night coding session, but her gaze remained determined. "Then we find another way. There has to be someone who can see what we've built here." Thomas rubbed his temples, fighting the familiar pressure that signaled cognitive fatigue. They had been refining the algorithm for nearly 6 weeks, working through nights, sacrificing sleep, pushing their shared vision forward inch by stubborn inch. The application now did more than match patients to treatments. It predicted outcomes, suggested modifications, learned from results. It was brilliant, revolutionary, and sitting in a basement where no one who mattered could see it. "It's my fault," Thomas said quietly. "My reputation is tainting the project. If you presented this on your own—" "That's ridiculous," Sophia interrupted. "I'm 19 with no credentials, no connections, and no credibility. Without you, I wouldn't even get in the door." "Without me, you wouldn't have 5 rejections," Thomas countered. Their debate was interrupted by footsteps on the basement stairs. Elena appeared, still in her hospital scrubs, looking exhausted but animated. "Sorry to interrupt, but I've been thinking about your investor problem." Thomas and Sophia exchanged glances. Elena had been supportive of their work, but had generally kept her distance from the technical and business aspects. "My hospital is hosting a medical innovation summit next month," Elena continued. "It's not huge, but there will be representatives from pharmaceutical companies, medical device manufacturers, hospital administrators, people with resources and influence." She handed Thomas a brochure. "I spoke with the organizer, Dr. Patel. He's agreed to let you present during the Emerging Technologies Showcase." Sophia's face lit up. "Mom, that's perfect." Thomas scanned the brochure, his excitement tempered with caution. "These showcases are usually for established startups or university research teams. We're neither." "I may have implied you were further along than you are," Eleanor admitted with a small smile. "But Dr. Patel respects your previous work, Thomas, and he trusts my judgment." The words struck Thomas unexpectedly. Your previous work. Not your name, not your wealth, but what you built. And more surprising still, a doctor who respected him not as a business titan, but as a fellow innovator in healthcare. 15 minutes on stage, Elena added. "Think you can make an impression in that time?" Sophia was already turning back to her computer. "We'll need to optimize the demo, focus on the clinical outcomes modeling. Maybe develop a simplified visualization for the biomarker correlations." Thomas watched her fingers fly across the keyboard, her mind already racing ahead to the presentation. He felt a strange mixture of pride and anxiety. This was their first real opportunity to bring their work into the light. If they succeeded, doors would open. If they failed... "Thank you, Elena," he said sincerely. "We won't let you down." Elena studied him with her nurse's perceptive gaze. "You know, when Miguel first told me he'd invited you to our barbecue, I thought he was crazy. The Thomas Reid, the billionaire tech CEO, at our backyard barbecue. But now..." She gestured to her daughter, then to Thomas. "Now I see what he saw." "What was that?" Thomas asked. "Two people who needed each other." She smiled, then headed back upstairs, leaving Thomas to ponder her words. The next 4 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Thomas and Sophia worked relentlessly, refining algorithms, designing interfaces, preparing demonstrations, rehearsing explanations that would translate complex technical concepts into compelling value propositions. They argued, compromised, pushed each other's thinking, and gradually shaped their presentation into something they believed could capture the imagination of potential partners. Thomas found that the focused work provided unexpected benefits. Beyond the project itself, the mental fog that had plagued him since his hemorrhage didn't vanish, but it became more navigable. He developed strategies to work around his limitations, breaking complex problems into smaller components, using visual aids to support his memory, leveraging Sophia's strengths to complement his weaknesses. The frustration remained, but its edge dulled as he learned to accept his new cognitive reality. Even more surprising was the physical transformation. The man who had once spent days in unwashed clothes, barely eating, hardly sleeping except when exhaustion or alcohol demanded, it now moved with purpose. He wasn't fully restored to his former self, likely never would be. But there was life in his eyes again, engagement in his voice, presence in his bearing that had been absent in the empty months after his collapse. "You look different," Miguel commented one evening as Thomas prepared to leave after another long work session. "Healthier," Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with personal observations. "Working will do that." "No," Miguel said thoughtfully. "Believing in something will do that. Big difference." The day before the summit, Thomas and Sophia conducted one final full rehearsal in the Alvarez living room, with Miguel and Elena serving as their test audience. Thomas handled the opening, explaining the problem they were solving, the limitations of current approaches, the potential impact of their solution. Sophia then demonstrated the technology, walking through representative case studies, showing how their algorithm discovered patterns human physicians had missed. "That's incredible," Elena said when they finished. "If this works the way you're describing, it could change how we approach treatment planning entirely." "If it works," Thomas emphasized. He had become the cautious one in their partnership, tempering Sophia's boundless optimism with practical concerns about validation, regulation, implementation challenges. "It will work," Sophia insisted. "The mathematics are sound. The early testing results are promising. We just need the opportunity to prove it at scale." Thomas nodded, conceding the point. Their product wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was built on solid principles, tested rigorously within the constraints of their limited resources, and designed to address a real and urgent need. Whether that would be enough to convince potential partners remained to be seen. The morning of the summit arrived with a steady Seattle rain that mirrored Thomas's internal weather. Cool, constant, not quite stormy, but charged with potential. Energy. He dressed with care in one of his old suits, tailored for a slightly heavier version of himself. The reflection in the mirror was both familiar and strange. Thomas Reid, tech executive, but with new lines around his eyes, a certain hesitancy in his gaze, a hard-won humility in his bearing. He drove to the Alvarez home to pick up Sophia, finding her pacing nervously in the front yard, sheltered from the rain by the porch overhang. She wore the closest thing she owned to business attire, black pants, an emerald green blouse borrowed. From her mother, low heels that made her walk with careful deliberation. Her usual confidence seemed muted, replaced by an anxious energy that manifested in constant small adjustments to her hair, her clothes, her posture. "You look professional," Thomas said as she slid into the passenger seat. "I look like I'm playing." "Dress up," Sophia countered, tugging at the blouse's unfamiliar collar. "I should have just worn my usual clothes. At least I'd be comfortable." "First impressions matter in these settings," Thomas said gently. "Right or wrong, people judge based on appearance. You want them focusing on your ideas, not wondering why the brilliant algorithm designer is dressed like a college student." "I am a college student," she reminded him, "or I would be if I hadn't decided to spend my gap year coding in a basement." Thomas smiled as he navigated through the rain-slicked streets toward downtown. "Best decision you ever made." "We'll see if you still think that after today," Sophia said, but she returned his smile, some of her confidence visibly returning. The summit was being held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, a sleek glass and steel structure in the heart of Seattle's business district. As they approached the entrance, Thomas felt a flicker of his old anxiety, the fear of being recognized, pitied, whispered about. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by a more immediate concern, ensuring their presentation went smoothly. The conference center buzzed with activity. Physicians in conservative suits, tech entrepreneurs in casual business attire, pharmaceutical representatives with perfect smiles and practiced handshakes. Name badges denoted affiliations with prestigious institutions, major corporations, influential investment firms. In this crowd of credentials and connections, Thomas and Sophia, representing no institution, backed by no corporation, felt conspicuously adrift. Dr. Alvarez, a distinguished Indian man in his 50s, approached them, greeting Elena, who had just arrived in her hospital administrator's blazer. "And you must be the innovators Elena has told me about." He extended his hand first, to Sophia, then to Thomas. "Dr. Rajiv Patel, Chief of Innovation at Northwest Memorial." "Thank you for including us in the showcase," Thomas said, noting with relief that Dr. Patel's expression showed no recognition of his name or face. Either the doctor didn't connect him to his previous identity, or more likely, he was being professionally discreet. "Elena speaks highly of your work," Dr. Patel replied. "She rarely advocates for presentations at these events, so when she insisted, I took notice." He checked his watch. "You're scheduled in Ballroom C at 2:30. I've arranged for several colleagues from pharmaceutical research to attend. Make the D most of your 15 minutes. As Dr. Patel moved on to greet other arrivals, Sophia leaned toward Thomas. "No pressure or anything." They spent the morning attending other sessions, studying how presenters engage their audiences, noting techniques they might incorporate into their own presentation. Thomas found it strange to be on this side of a tech conference, an unknown attendee rather than a featured keynote speaker. There was freedom in the anonymity, a chance to observe without being observed, to learn without the pressure of already being expected to know everything. After a quick lunch, where neither of them managed more than a few bites, they made their way to Ballroom C to set up. The room was smaller than Thomas had expected, perhaps 60 seats, about half of which were filled as their scheduled time. They approached, a modest audience by industry standards, but each person represented potential access to resources, data sets, clinical environments, the very things they needed to advance their work, from promising prototype to validated solution. As they connected Sophia's laptop to the presentation system, Thomas scanned the audience. He recognized representatives from 2 pharmaceutical companies, several hospital administrators, a handful of physicians, and, his heart sank slightly, James Robertson from Horizon's board, sitting in the back row with an expression of idle curiosity. "James is here," Thomas murmured to Sophia as they prepared their materials. "Who?" "Board member from Horizon, one of the people who orchestrated my removal." Sophia glanced toward the back of the room, then returned to checking her demonstration. "Doesn't matter. We're not here for him. We're here for the people who might actually help us." Her focus steadied him. She was right. They had more important concerns than old corporate politics. Still, James's presence added an unwelcome layer of pressure to an already tense situation. At precisely 2:30, Dr. Patel stepped to the podium to introduce them. His words were brief but impactful. "Our next presenters represent the kind of innovative collaboration we aim to foster, combining deep healthcare systems expertise with fresh thinking in algorithmic design. Please welcome Thomas Reid and Sophia Alvarez, presenting their work on predictive analytics for precision treatment matching." There was polite applause as Thomas moved to the podium. He looked out at the audience, felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the slight blurring at the edges of his vision that signaled cognitive stress. For a moment he feared he might freeze, might lose the thread of his carefully prepared opening. Then his gaze found Eleanor, sitting in the second row, her expression conveying absolute confidence in him. Beyond her sat Miguel, looking slightly uncomfortable in his one good suit, but radiating pride and support. The sight of them, these people who had welcomed him into their home, their family, their lives, steadied him. "Healthcare is failing. Impatience," Thomas began, his voice stronger than he had anticipated, not through lack of dedication or expertise, but through an inability to process complexity at scale. The human mind, even the most brilliant physician's mind, can track perhaps a few dozen variables when making treatment decisions. But the factors that determine a patient's response to treatment number in the hundreds, with complex interdependencies that change over time. He continued, outlining the problem in terms medical professionals would recognize from their daily practice. The uncertainty of treatment selection, the trial and error approach that wasted precious time for critically ill patients, the vast repository of clinical data that contained patterns no human could fully discern. "What if we could cut through this complexity?" Thomas asked, warming to his subject. "What if we could identify the specific factors that predict an individual patient's response to a particular treatment, not based on broad population studies, but on precise biomarker patterns unique to that individual?" He gestured to Sophia, who stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her material thoroughly. She took the audience through the technical approach, explaining the adaptive weighting algorithm, the Bayesian inference model for handling incomplete data, the machine learning components that improved accuracy over time. She showed visualizations of pattern recognition across test datasets, demonstrated how the system had identified correlations that had eluded human analysts. Thomas watched her with a mixture of pride and amazement. This young woman, barely out of high school, was holding a room of medical professionals and business executives in rapt attention. Her explanations were clear, her examples compelling, her understanding of the technology profound. In that moment, he saw not just who she was, but who she would become, a force to be reckoned with, a mind that would change healthcare in ways he had never imagined. As they moved to the demonstration phase, Thomas stepped forward again. They had rehearsed this carefully. Sophia would operate the system while Thomas narrated, explaining the implications of what they were showing. It was a partnership that played to both their strengths, and as they proceeded through the demonstration, Thomas could sense the energy in the room, shifting from polite interest to genuine engagement. Questions began even before they had formally opened the floor. Technical inquiries about the algorithm's handling of edge cases, practical concerns about implementation in clinical workflows, regulatory questions about validation and approval, pathways. Thomas and Sophia fielded them with practiced coordination, each stepping in when the question aligned with their expertise. supporting each other when challenges arose. What makes you different from other AI diagnostic systems already on the market? Asked a pharmaceutical executive in the front row. We're not a diagnostic system, Sophia clarified. We don't tell physicians what condition a patient has. We predict which treatments will be most effective for patients with already diagnosed conditions based on their specific biomarker profile. And unlike most systems, Thomas added, we don't require complete data to generate useful predictions. Our algorithm is specifically designed to work with the partial information that's typically available in real clinical settings. Another hand raised. How do you validate your predictions? What's your error rate? That's precisely why we're here, Thomas acknowledged candidly. Our early testing with limited datasets shows promising results, an accuracy rate of 82% in predicting treatment response for the conditions we've modeled so far. But we need access to larger datasets and clinical environments to validate these findings properly. What you're describing would require extensive FDA approval processes, noted a woman Thomas recognized as the Regulatory Affairs Director for a major pharmaceutical company. Have you begun that pathway? Not yet, Thomas admitted. We're seeking partners with experience in regulatory navigation to help guide that process. The questions continued, increasingly detailed, increasingly challenging. Thomas felt his energy flagging, the cognitive fog threatening to descend. Sophia noticed immediately, seamlessly taking over more of the responses, supporting him without drawing attention to his struggle. Finally, Dr. Patel stepped to the podium. I'm afraid we need to wrap up this session, though it's clear there's significant interest in continuing the conversation. Mr. Reid and Ms. Alvarez will be available at the networking reception following this session block. As the audience began to disperse, several attendees approached the stage, business cards in hand, questions still forming on their lips. Thomas and Sophia found themselves separated, each engaged with different potential partners, exchanging contact information, scheduling follow-up meetings, fielding increasingly specific inquiries about their technology and plans. Thomas was deep in conversation with the chief medical officer of a regional hospital network when he felt a presence at his shoulder. He turned to find James Robertson, his former board member, watching him with an inscrutable expression. Interesting. Presentation, Thomas, James said, his voice neutral. Not what I expected when I saw your name on the program. Thomas maintained his composure. What did you expect? Honestly, I wasn't sure. The Thomas Reid I knew was building systems to optimize hospital billing, not algorithms to improve patient care. The observation stung, partly because it contained a kernel of truth. Horizon's products had primarily focused on administrative efficiency, cost reduction, operational optimization, valuable goals certainly, but adjacent to rather than centered on patient outcomes. People change, Thomas said simply. James studied him for a moment. So it seems. He glanced toward Sophia, who was engrossed in a technical discussion with several physicians. Your partner is impressive. Where did you find her? I didn't. She found me. The words came out with more emotion than Thomas had intended. James raised an eyebrow, then handed Thomas a business card. The board would be interested in hearing more about this project. Call my office next week. Thomas accepted the card automatically, years of business instinct overriding his personal feelings about the man. Why would Horizon be interested? This is outside your current product focus. Let's just say the company's vision has expanded since your departure. James's smile didn't reach his eyes. As I recall, that was precisely our disagreement before your health issues. The reference to his hemorrhage was deliberate, a subtle reminder of Thomas's vulnerability, his diminished status. Before Thomas could respond, James continued. Think about it, Thomas. Horizon has the resources, the market position, the regulatory experience to bring this to scale quickly. Working alone, you're looking at years of struggle with no guarantee of success. He nodded curtly and walked away, leaving Thomas holding his card and a complex mix of emotions. The remainder of the reception passed in a blur of conversations, exchanges of information, promises to follow up. By the time the event concluded, Thomas and Sophia had collected nearly 20 business cards, scheduled 5 follow-up meetings, and received expressions of interest from 3 potential clinical partners. "That was amazing," Sophia exclaimed as they finally made their way to the parking garage. "Did you see how Dr. Chen reacted when I showed him the biomarker correlation visualization? He practically started designing trials on the spot." Thomas nodded, trying to share her enthusiasm while processing his encounter with James. "You were brilliant, Sophia. Truly, the technical questions didn't faze you at all. Only because we practiced so much," she admitted, "and because you were there to handle the business and healthcare system questions." She nudged his shoulder playfully. "We make a good team." "We do," Thomas agreed, the simple truth of it washing away some of his unease about James's proposition. As they drove back to the Alvarez home, Sophia sorted through the business cards they had collected, organizing them by type of organization, level of expressed interest, potential value as partners. Her energy seemed inexhaustible, her mind already racing ahead to next steps, future developments, possibilities that had been merely theoretical before today's validation. Thomas listened, offering occasional input, but his thoughts kept returning to James's card, tucked into his jacket pocket like a small, loaded weapon. The offer was tempting in its practicality. Horizon did indeed have everything they needed to bring their algorithm to market quickly. The resources, the connections, the regulatory expertise, the established customer base of hospitals and healthcare systems. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Horizon's help would come at a price neither he nor Sophia had fully calculated. James Robertson had not reached his position by missing opportunities or leaving value on the table. If he was interested in their project, it was because he saw potential worth capturing, worth controlling. "You're quiet," Sophia observed as they neared her home. "Tired?" "Just thinking," Thomas replied. "We have decisions to make. About which partners to pursue. I'm leaning towards starting with the clinical validation. If we can get Northwestern Memorial to run a small trial, that would give us the data we need to approach the bigger pharmaceutical companies." Thomas nodded. "That makes sense." He hesitated, then added, "There's another option we should discuss." Horizon expressed interest. Sophia's eyebrows rose. "Your old company? The one that pushed you out?" "They have everything we need," Thomas said, feeling compelled to present the option fairly despite his reservations. Resources, regulatory experience, market access. "And what would they want in return?" Sophia asked shrewdly. Thomas smiled, faintly. For all her youth, Sophia had a businessman's intuition for the unspoken parts of deals. Control, most likely. Ownership of the IP, integration into their existing systems. "Your name off the project," Sophia added quietly. "Your influence minimized." Thomas didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. They arrived at the Alvarez home, where Elena and Miguel were waiting on the porch, eager for details about the presentation. As Sophia bounded from the car, already launching into an excited recounting of the day's events, Thomas remained seated, watching the family's animated interaction through the windshield. In that moment, seeing Sophia's brilliant future unfolding before her, seeing the pride and love surrounding her, Thomas made his decision. Whatever path they chose, it would be one that preserved her ownership of her creation, her voice in its development. her name on its success. She deserved that chance, the chance to build something that truly reflected her vision, not merely advance someone else's agenda, even if that meant a harder road, even if that meant turning down the easy path that Horizon offered, even if that meant facing James Robertson across a negotiating table once again, this time from a position of relative weakness. Thomas finally exited the car and joined the family on the porch, allowing himself to be drawn into their celebration, their simple joy in the day's achievements. As Miguel handed him a beer and Elena asked for his perspective on the audience's response, Thomas felt the weight of James's business card in his pocket lightening. The coming weeks would bring difficult negotiations, resource constraints, regulatory hurdles, but they would face them together. Not just he and Sophia, but this entire unlikely family that had somehow formed around them. And whatever emerged from their work would be built on something Horizon could never offer: genuine belief in the vision, not just its market potential. As the evening deepened and plans for next steps took shape around the Alvarez dining table, Thomas realized that his healing journey had progressed further than he had recognized. The cognitive fog remained, the limitations real, but something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he was helping to create, no longer measured by past achievements, but by present contributions. In the warm light of the Alvarez kitchen, surrounded by people who valued him not for his name or wealth, but for himself, Thomas Reid felt something he had never experienced at the height of his success: belonging. Not the isolated peak of individual achievement, but the intertwined support of meaningful connection. It wasn't the life he had planned. It wasn't the recovery he had imagined. But as he watched Sophia sketching out implementation plans on a paper napkin, her brilliance flowing unconstrained, he knew with absolute certainty: this was better than what had been lost. This was real. This was healing. The Alvarez dining room had become their war room. Blueprints and business plans spread across the oak table where family dinners once reigned supreme. Miguel studied the medtech contract with reading glasses perched on his nose, while Elena took notes on a yellow legal pad. 18 million is life-changing money, Miguel said finally, removing his glasses. But so is what you've built. Sophia glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. We think we can negotiate better terms, she said. Maybe keep more control, establish clearer boundaries about intellectual property. Elena tapped her pen against the pad. Or you could see what other offers are out there. Northwestern itself might invest. Maybe even patient advocacy groups who understand the real value of what you're creating. Thomas watched this family consultation with a mixture of amusement and profound respect. A plumber and a nurse analyzing venture capital terms with the seriousness of Wall Street analysts, and making valid points his own board at Horizon would have missed. We have another option, Thomas said quietly. All eyes turned to him. We could say no. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Sophia leaned forward. And do what instead? Build it ourselves. Slower, smaller scale at first, but entirely on our terms. Thomas tapped the validation results from Northwestern. These results are extraordinary. We could secure smaller investments from angel investors who believe in the mission, partner with research hospitals for validation, and grow organically without sacrificing control. Miguel nodded slowly. The harder path. But potentially the right one, Thomas replied. Sometimes the fastest route isn't the best destination. 3 days later, Thomas and Sophia sat across from Diane Foster in MedTech's sleek conference room. Their decision had been unanimous after hours of discussion around the Alvarez table. We appreciate your generous offer, Thomas began, but we've decided to pursue independent development at this time. Diane's composed expression flickered briefly. That's surprising. Our terms were extremely favorable for a company at your stage. They were, Sophia acknowledged. But we believe our technology has the potential to fundamentally change how treatment decisions are made. We want to ensure it develops with patient outcomes as the primary focus, not quarterly earnings or strategic market positioning. Noble, Diane said with the faintest edge, but idealism doesn't navigate FDA approval or build integration capabilities across hospital systems. True, Thomas conceded, which is why we'd like to propose an alternative, a joint development agreement rather than an investment. You maintain your capital, we maintain our independence, and we collaborate on specific applications where our technologies complement each other. Diane studied them both, recalculating her position. A more limited partnership. A more focused one, Thomas corrected, with clear boundaries and shared success metrics tied directly to patient outcomes. The negotiation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, stretching from adversarial to collaborative as the framework of a new kind of partnership took shape. When they finally emerged, Sophia and Thomas had secured something rare in healthcare technology, a development partnership that preserved their core mission while leveraging an established company's infrastructure and market access. Word spread quickly through the industry's tight circles. Thomas Reid, once the ruthless efficiency optimizer, was charting a new path focused on patient outcomes over profit maximization. Sophia Alvarez, the plumber's daughter coding in a basement, had become the face of a new generation of healthcare innovators driven by purpose rather than prestige. Northwestern Memorial's publication of their validation results in the Journal of Medical Informatics sent ripples through the medical community. 3 additional research hospitals signed agreements to implement predictive health's algorithm in controlled clinical environments. A patient advocacy group for rare diseases provided a grant to adapt the system specifically for conditions with limited treatment options and small patient populations. 6 months after declining MedTech's investment, Predictive Health Systems moved into modest offices in a renovated warehouse building. Their small team had grown to include 5 engineers, a regulatory affairs specialist, and a clinical implementation coordinator. Miguel had insisted on handling the office renovation himself, building custom workstations and meeting spaces that reflected the company's practical, patient-focused ethos. Thomas sat at his desk by the window, reviewing their first quarterly report as an operational company. Revenue was still minimal, primarily from research licensing fees, but their burn rate was sustainable, their development roadmap clear, their mission intact. Outside his office, he could see Sophia leading a technical discussion with their engineering team, her natural leadership emerging as she guided the evolution of the system she had first imagined in her parents' basement. His phone buzzed with an incoming call, James Robertson from Horizon. Thomas ignored it as he had the previous 3 attempts. Whatever acquisition proposals or veiled threats James wanted to deliver could wait. They had patience to help. Later that evening, Thomas joined the Alvarez family for their traditional Sunday dinner. As Miguel grilled steaks on the patio and Elena prepared her famous potato salad, Thomas watched Sophia showing her younger cousins how the algorithm worked, using a simplified demo she had built specifically for explaining complex concepts to non-technical audiences. "Not quite the life you imagined when we first met, is it?" Miguel asked, handing Thomas a beer. Thomas smiled, thinking back to the broken man sitting alone in an empty lake house, trapped in silence and regret. "No," he admitted. "It's better." Now, 1 year to the day after Thomas first encountered Sophia at the Alvarez family barbecue, the FDA granted preliminary approval for limited clinical implementation of Predictive Health's algorithm in oncology treatment planning. The system that began as a teenage girl's coding project at 2 a.m. had officially entered medical practice, with documented success in matching patients to treatments that improved outcomes while reducing unnecessary side effects. The revolution had begun, not from the gleaming towers of corporate healthcare or the ivy-covered walls of elite institutions, but from a plumber's basement where a fallen titan and an unlikely prodigy had discovered that healing comes in many forms. And the most meaningful legacy isn't measured in dollars, but in lives transformed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.